whether that's just a search for lost youth, or what I more like to think of is, that you guys are the future. And without the future, we are nothing. So the title is a reference to a wonderful book that I highly recommend, if I get the right book on this, which one is it? By Albert Facey, called The Fortunate Life. And there's an irony in the title, because it's hard to imagine somebody who had a harder life. He was born in the late 19th century in Western Australia, had a very hard upbringing on remote farmland communities in Western Australia, fought and survived Gallipoli in the First World War, went back to Australia to go back to his rural roots, lost everything in the Depression, lost his son in the Second World War, worked very hard and largely unsuccessfully as an early union activist in Australia, and died at a fine old age saying, I have had a fortunate life. So I think it's a very inspiring story which you might want to read. But I certainly feel I've had a very fortunate life, in particular, a very fortunate career, which is, I'm assuming, the only part of my life that's of remote interest to the audience. So this is a potted summary of my career, which is that it's been a series of happy accidents. And the first happy accident was taking 5 years to get my bachelor's degree. And the reason was that I fell ill, and the consequence of falling ill was that I had to leave Edinburgh, and after a break I finished my undergraduate degree at Liverpool. More of why that was an important happy accident in a few minutes. I then went to Oxford to do an MSc, and the only reason I did an MSc is because I should have done a PhD. But my supervisor announced, after I'd been there for 3 months, he was going to Australia. So I thought, well, I don't know what I'm doing down here in Oxford. Because contrary to what it is now, it wasn't actually a particularly strong centre of statistics in those days. And with my supervisor gone, I went back to Liverpool and thought I'd do my PhD at Liverpool. But then the next happy accident was that my supervisor in Liverpool said, you can come and do your PhD with me, but I'm applying for a job at Newcastle. But I'm applying for a senior job, and they've also got a junior job, so why don't you apply as well? So I thought, fair enough. So I applied for a lectureship at Newcastle, duly got interviewed, and went to see my supervisor and said, I got an interview, and he said, oh, I didn't apply. So 3 months after going back to do my PhD, I had a lectureship in Newcastle at one time. Well, I really landed on my feet because I had a wonderful boss who really protected me against a lot of the pressures that I see young academics have to cope with really very early in their career today. And I'm sure that's true in a lot of industries, that you really do have to hit the ground running in a way that I didn't. I mean, my first academic year consisted of being required to give 6 lectures, and the rest of my time was my own. And that was a typical baptism for somebody, in a good department and with a good head, and that's the critical thing. Because there were plenty of colleagues who would have loved me to take over their lecture courses for me, but my boss protected me and said, no, you need time to get established. And in particular, while I was at Newcastle, I made 2 rather influential visits. I went to Sweden, and why go and work for the Royal College of Forestry? That's kind of like a bit of an odd thing. And again, it was a happy accident because at the time I had an aversion to America. I'm rapidly recovering, regaining my aversion to America, at least in the political sense. But at the time, my aversion to America was due to an entirely ill-informed view that American statistics was highly theoretical and mathematical and technical. And I was really quite interested in applications of various kinds. But I knew one name of a statistician in Sweden who worked in the area that I worked in at the time, which is spatial statistics. And I knew nothing about him except that he'd done this really pioneering work in spatial statistics. So I found his address and wrote to him and said I wanted to spend my sabbatical with him. And unbeknown to me, he worked in a forestry college. And he required me, in order to justify paying me, to go out in the field with the foresters and actually do some data collection. So I did my first field work in Sweden in 1978. And that's a really good way to understand data, actually collecting yourself in any field. It's not like it is in the textbooks. It's relationship very quickly there. Okay, I also had the opportunity at Newcastle to visit Australia, and that was really a very profound formative experience in understanding, well, personally understanding, in a way that I didn't as an academic, the important and in some ways really rather subtle linkage between statistics and subject matter science, or indeed subject matter engineering and industry, whatever. And superficially, it's very obvious what the link is, but actually forming a working partnership between statisticians and non-statisticians was something I didn't have to do as a young academic, and I had to do as soon as I went to Australia. And so I enjoyed my visit there so much, I went back for a few years and almost made my career there. But my next happy accident was while I was working in Australia, I was editing the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society Series B, and that earned me a trip back to London each September. And at an RSS ordinary meeting, and in particular at the dinner afterwards, I met an American statistician who worked in the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, and he invited me to visit there, and that's when I got interested in health and medicine as a professional sort of focus for my work. So, going back to what I was when I started my academic career, which was somebody who claimed to be doing research into stochastic processes, 10 years later I'd become a sort of fledgling medical statistician. And then various things happened, which were not very congenial to me in Australia, some public knowledge, some not, and I'll stay there. I came to Lancaster in 1988, and at the time, my colleagues in Australia said, why on earth are you going to Lancaster? Because there are 3 statisticians at Lancaster, which is what it was the state in 1988. And I gave the honest answer that I did not give to you, which is, it looks like a nice place to live. So I arrived, and with a lot of support from a lot of very fine colleagues, I helped to build up Lancaster, and as many of you will know, it's now one of the biggest statistics departments in the country. And so, again, it was a happy accident. I was unhappy in Australia, there was an ad in the paper, I thought, that looks like a nice place to live. And when I got there, I found that there was actually a lot of people, although the numbers were small, the general sort of atmosphere was very congenial to developing the kind of applied statistical research that I wanted to do. So, when Lancaster, its wisdom, 20 years later, opened a medical school, I jumped ship and moved to the medical school, because by then I was thoroughly concentrating my personal work in health and medicine. To the extent that for several years I actually took a half-time job at Liverpool and reduced to half-time at Lancaster, and I did that because by then I'd had some chance meetings with people who were doing work in Africa, and I really thought that looks really both useful and fascinating and challenging, and Liverpool had a research institute in infection and global health, which Lancaster did not. As you can see, it's a fledgling medical school. And so I spent 2 years there making some very, very useful and continuing contacts in Africa in particular, but in tropical countries more generally, which continue even now back in Lancaster with my research. So that's the possible history, and it's only taken 5 minutes, so I better say something else. So we'll do this as a little quiz, because I didn't mention any names in that first slide. Some of you will know them, and some of you will have guessed them. So who knows who that is? Died quite recently. Yeah. Julian Bizag. Yes. Okay, now here's something to inspire young people for whom university doesn't quite work out. Does anybody know what Julian Bizag's highest academic qualification was? It was a 2-1 BSc from Birmingham. Does anyone know what his highest accolade was? Fellow of the Royal Society. So even if things go wrong early in your career, you can recover. And Julian was both an inspirational undergraduate teacher to me in Liverpool, so I would never have met him if I hadn't fallen ill, because I would have graduated from Edinburgh and probably gone and worked with the Scottish office and probably had a perfectly satisfactory career, but wouldn't have been an academic. And also, Julian was the PhD supervisor in Liverpool who invited me back to work with him and then promptly engineered my exit to Newcastle. I still think, I never asked him specifically. I knew Julian all his life, and he died tragically a few years ago at the age of 65. But I still think he was really just kidding about moving himself, and he just thought he wanted to encourage me to go for a job, and indeed I got one. Who knows? Okay, this might be trickier, particularly for the younger people. Anybody recognise this person? Okay, anybody at least recognise the name, and I'll tell you who it is. Plackett, Robin Plackett. It's a name people have heard, particularly people in industry, because he did a lot of pioneering work on the design of industrial experiments. But he was the professor at Newcastle who protected me in my first year, encouraged me to take a sabbatical, generally made sure that I didn't get buried from day one in all of the necessary, but for a starting lecturer, potentially quite burdensome and distracting things about academia. I owe him an enormous debt of thanks for that. That's a tricky one unless you do spatial statistics. But that's the person I went to work with in Sweden. And if you do spatial statistics, you may have heard of something mysterious called the Matern correlation function. Anyone heard of that? No spatial statisticians in the audience. Shame. Okay, anyway, Bertil Matern was the person who whose work I'd encountered as a research student. And when I had the opportunity to go to for a sabbatical, and I didn't want to go to America, I thought, well, Bertil Matern's a name, I'll write to him, and discovered he lived and worked in Sweden. And that's, as I said earlier, where I then had to earn my crust as a statistician in the College of Forestry, and I had to partly earn my crust going out with foresters and doing field work in the primary data collection, which was something that stood me in enormous good stead. Anybody know this smiling gentleman? A good man to have a few beers with. This is an Australian statistician, as you can see from the heading. His name's Nick Fisher. Anybody heard of Nick Fisher? No relation to R.A. Fisher, right? But he's there partly because he became a good friend, and he's really just one of 20 or 30 Australian statisticians I could have listed, because that was on my visit to Australia where I learned about the intersection between statistics and science. Really building on my experiences in Sweden, but getting involved much more deeply, working all together for 4 or 5 years with CSIRO in Australia. And I'm pretty sure that, oh no, you should know this person actually. This is my American friend, who I met in London at an RSS ordinary meeting. No clues? Scott Ziegler? Really know the name? Oh, there's something wrong with your education. Okay. Scott Ziegler is one of the biggest names in biostatistics in America. A very successful head of department at Johns Hopkins University for many years. Rose to be provost, which is essentially equivalent to vice chancellor. Decided he wanted to go back to the bench. But I met him by chance at an RSS meeting, and we visited each other. We wrote 2 books together, we wrote papers together, and we've shared research students. So chance academic meetings come from chance face-to-face meetings at, there wasn't this building in those days, but at RSS. And we were talking downstairs about, do we still need live face-to-face meetings? You know, why don't we just go and watch the movie? And I think for the actual ostensible business of the day, that's a fair comment. I don't think any of you will get anything from this talk that you wouldn't get by watching it on a movie, except that by the time it's on a movie, you'll have better things to do with your time, I'm sure. But the chance meetings that you have when you go to scientific events of all kinds are often the most valuable. Don't think anybody with the possible section of MA will recognise this person. Yeah? His name's David Towers, and he's a pure mathematician. And I've called him a benevolent mathematician because I've had my run-ins with pure mathematicians in my career, both at Newcastle and in Australia. But David, as the pure maths head of a pure maths department at Lancaster with 3 statisticians in it, gave me my head completely to develop statistics within his department. And he basically gave me all the authority of the head of the department with none of the responsibility. And so, again, I owe David an enormous debt. That I think is the end of the road theory here. Okay, so what I thought I'd do for the remaining few minutes is just elaborate a little bit on why some of those connections are so important to me. And I don't want to dwell too much on technicalities, particularly as I think we've established that there aren't any spatial statisticians in the room, so the possible exception of Poppy. Spatial statistics, which is basically doing statistics when where you collect data matters, is a subject that was in its infancy in the 1970s. And so yet another happy accident for me was being in at the start of an important new area of statistical theory and application. Julian was one of the prime movers and wrote one of the 2 most important and influential papers in spatial statistics during the 1970s. And there he is again in his boat, looking a little bit more crusty than in the previous picture, and that's more how people remember him, unfortunately. He was notoriously bad-tempered, but with a heart of gold. Below him is a rather younger than he is today, Brian Ripley, who wrote a breakthrough paper in the analysis of spatial point distributions. I'll illustrate these in the next slide, just a few years after Julian's paper. If you look at the citation of those 2 papers, you'll see they're pretty impressive. They were really 2 very influential papers. Okay, now, this is a statistics audience, so we'll have a little bit of maths. And the first really intriguing thing about spatial statistics that you learn, and it's discussed in detail in Julian's paper, is that space is not like time. Now, at one level, everybody knows that, okay, because time is ordered and space is not. But it does have some surprising consequences. So, if you can imagine something, I thought there was a what's it, if you can imagine doing a time series course in statistics, one of the things you almost certainly encountered is the first order autoregressive process. So you could all tell me what that is. And a first order autoregressive process says if you want to model a time series at y, and you think that what's happening today depends on what happened yesterday, but once you know what happened yesterday, you don't need to worry about what happened the day before, then that's the Markov property in time. And the simplest Markov model for a time series is the autoregressive model, which just says what you see today is a discounted proportion of what you saw yesterday with a counterbalancing so-called innovation, which is an independent random term that's added to it. And if you actually then want to construct a likelihood for the data that you get from an autoregressive process, you know that a joint distribution can always be factorized as y1 times y2 given y1 times y3 given y1 and y2, etc. Right? Well, by the Markov property, that simplifies to y1, y2 given y1, y3 given y2, y4 given y3. We're done. And it's blindingly obvious that those conditional distributions are like they are on the right-hand side of the implication. So that if I've conditioned on everything in the past, what I've got is a normal distribution with a mean which is a linear discounted proportion of what I saw yesterday, and a variance. Obvious, right? First year undergraduate stuff or even school stuff. Very, very trivial. Well, when people started thinking about spatial statistics, imagine space is in one line, one-dimensional space, right? Then the obvious analogue of the autoregressive process is to say that what you see here is a discounted version of the average of what you see to your left and to your right, because there's no directionality in space. Fine. So that's a spatial autoregression. No, 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 says another statistician. The fundamental property of the autoregression is these conditional distributions. That's what gives you the likelihood. That's what allows you to make inference. So what you really want to do is write down a conditional statement that, given everything except what's happening here, all you need to know about is what's immediately to your left and immediately to your right. Unfortunately, it's not true. So those are actually different models. And that little observation and things like it promoted, believe it or not, and this is the thing that gives statisticians a bad name in general society, years of impassioned debate as to which was the right way to build spatial models. And ultimately, the conditionalists, if you want to call them that, triumphed. And if you ever find yourself using directed acyclic graphs, or graphical models for multivariate data, or hierarchically specified models, sometimes called causal diagrams, whatever, what you're actually doing is building Markov random field models. And there's a wonderful moment in the meeting in 1974 when Professor Alan Hawkes, then of Swansea University, in seconding the vote of thanks to Julian, said exactly this. And the point is, that in red was, I'm there, I'm convinced it was just something he suddenly thought up on the spur of the moment. Because there was a deliberate pause after he, well, maybe he was just being theatrical, but anyway. The paper was ostensibly about spatial statistics. But if you look at the idea that you want to understand the distributions of a set of random variables yi, conditional on all the other random variables in the set of interest, then this theorem, the Hammersley-Clifford theorem, tells you how to do that so that you don't commit a nonsense. Right? And the reason it's not trivial is because of this non-equivalence that I showed in the previous ones. And the point about that is there's no space there, there's just a set of random variables. So actually it's a way of specifying multivariate distributions. And it turns out to be much, much more flexible than trying to specify joint multivariate distributions directly. How many people know of a really good family of multivariate distributions other than the norm? There are one or two around, but they're pretty kind of limited. But as long as you obey the Hammersley-Clifford theorem, these conditional distributions can be anything you like. Binomial, Poisson, exponential, gamma, final, normal, extreme value, anything you like. So it was really very influential beyond spatial statistics. Okay, I won't spend too much time on the technicalities, but let's have a quick look at what Brian did. Well, Brian Ripley said, what is a spatial pattern? It's a set of data in which actual positions in space are stochastically generated. In other words, it's a point process in space. And he argued that if you wanted to summarize a data set like the red and blue dots up there, you can't just reduce it to numbers, but maybe you can reduce it to functions. And maybe those functions can operate essentially as signatures for the properties of the process that generated the pattern. And basically what you do is you look at the pattern of distances between pairs of points and see if you can see any structure in those. And this is not the occasion to go into detail, but basically the question that these data pose, they're from a neuroanatomy investigation into the construction of the retina in a rabbit. And the question that the neuroanatomists posed at the time was, we don't know how these two kinds of cells are formed in the retina of the eye, but we do know two things about them. Firstly, they're functionally quite different. One responds to a light going on and transmits a message to the brain. The other responds to a light going off and transmits a message to the brain. So in order to see efficiently, you need both of them. What we don't know, we also know that when you look at them under the microscope, they're physically very similar, but they sit at slightly different depths in the retina. And what we want to know is whether they initially sit in an undifferentiated layer and then get coloured in, or whether they initially sit in separate layers and then fuse to form the retina. And it turns out that those functions are enough to give you a very strong signal that actually they form in separate layers and subsequently fuse to form a mature retina. Now this is not a technical talk, and it's all written up in the literature. If anyone's interested, I'll be staying around for mine, and I can bore you about this stuff if you really want me to. But it was the kind of breakthrough that says, don't look for simple numbers or simple tests. Think of functions as signatures of patterns that make Brian's paper so important. Okay, now where did the nomic Swede come in? Well, this is kind of interesting, because when I started as a research student in Oxford initially, my supervisor gave me Journal of the Royal Statistical Society papers to read, Biometrica papers to read, Journal of the American Statistical Association papers to read, and this thing. And I thought, well, A, what is it? B, where on earth do I find it? And it turns out that you only got it by getting a photocopy from somebody else who had a photocopy, because essentially it was an unpublished book that sat in the library of that's Swedish for Royal Forestry College in Stockholm. But it was full, it was like a goldmine, full of ideas that were subsequently developed by other people. But the elements of modern geostatistics are all there, the elements of random sets and point processes, including the kind of things that Brian was doing in 1977, were all there. Only the elements. I'm absolutely, and I really mean it's not suggesting anybody copied Bertil's work. They built on it in an honest way. They all referred to this thesis, you see, and you went back and said, how do I find that? So that was the starting point for all of this stuff that Julian and Brian were doing 10, 15, 20 years later. He actually wrote it in the 1940s. It's an extraordinary work. And also challenges the conventional wisdom that you shouldn't do random sampling if you're interested in spatial variation. Systematic sampling beats random sampling every time if you want to understand spatial variation. And it's a consequence of the non-independence of measurements that you take at different locations on the same phenomenon. So, you know, an extraordinary man, because I think in his career he probably published less than 10 papers. But his thesis is still read today. It's still in print. It was eventually published by Springer because so many people wanted to read it. They asked Bertil if they would mind if they printed it. So they did. So it's a Springer lecture. Okay, now where did the Australians prove so influential to me? Well, it's basically they started me thinking about a question that I elaborated on in my presidential address, which is, in a university or a research institute or a research department of a big company, where should statisticians sit? And where statisticians sat in CSIRO in Australia, which was the acronym is Commonwealth of Australia, Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation. So it was very much, and we had a whole division called Mathematics and Statistics with 100 professional statisticians in it, spread around Australia, all the state capitals, but supposedly interacting with the subject matter scientists, but critically also interacting with each other. So in other words, they weren't just placed there as statistical slaves to do t-tests on demand. They had the same status as the subject matter scientists, but equally they had an obligation to collaborate with them in a mutually beneficial way. And so each of us had two offices. Now try taking that to your resources manager in your company or university. I'd like two offices for each of my statisticians. Oh yeah, you'll have a frosty reception. But there's a lot of space in Australia, and it wasn't a problem. But it really changed the climate, because we physically went to our science office to talk to the scientists. I was in wildlife research. At the time I was sort of a statistical ecologist, for want of a better name. And you also came to the home base in maths and stats, where we had a weekly half-day meeting, sharing ideas, getting tips on what we could do to help the geologists or the ecologists or whatever, but also going to seminars on statistics and feeding off each other. So we were able to, as the strapline says, combine statistical innovation, even if misspelled, with scientific relevance, which to me is the absolute cornerstone of statistics. If it's not relevant to somebody other than a statistician, why are you doing it? Because statistics is fundamentally a parasitic discipline. Then I came back to England. As I said, for no better reason than the Lake District is a very nice place to live. And Lancaster just sits tidily on the edge of it. But it was 1989, and you're far too young. But that was about the time when people started worrying about cancer clusters near nuclear installations. A very famous one in Sellafield, which happens to be quite close to Lancaster. And so when I came back to Lancaster, I discovered that not statisticians, none of the statisticians were interested, but geographers were interested in understanding the geographical distribution of leukemia cases near Sellafield, or cancer cases of various kinds near other nuclear installations, and that spread out to generally being concerned about industrial pollution and the health hazards that creates. And that's a whole area of study now that people spend their careers on. But it all goes back to the famous map that John Snow drew of Soho in the 1840s, where the black dots on the map represent cases of cholera, but the whole area of the map is populated with people, and the question of why are they all clustered around Broad Street is, as almost everyone now knows, because the Broad Street pump was conveying infected water from the Thames. And when people stopped drinking the water, they stopped being at risk of cholera. And so John Snow is still celebrated by the pub. It's in his name in Broad Street, now Broadwick Street, and there's a replica of the pub outside the pub. It's a nice pub. You should go there if you haven't already done. But, in 1990, instead of Broad Street pump, we had Sellafield. Instead of cholera, we had leukemia. And I have to say, the association is considerably weaker than the association that John Snow found, and arguably isn't actually a causal association with radiation from nuclear power stations per se at all, but it's something to do with the vulnerability of communities that have unusually high levels of social mixing, having been previously rather isolated. What's that got to do with nuclear power stations? Well, for some reason, some of you may guess how. When the nuclear industry was growing up in Britain, and my father was a nuclear physicist, so I was part of it, they built all these reactors in very remote places. I wonder why they did that. But then they needed a lot of scientists, engineers, fitters, caterers, everybody to come. And so the small villages around these remote places grew into towns, and there was a massive migration inward of people who previously been in separate communities. So it's kind of like a very minor version of what happened to the poor old Incas when the Spaniards arrived, because they brought diseases that the Incas would not, would have no immunity to. Now that's not my theory, that's the theory of an epidemiologist called Kinlan, who wrote about it at the time, and in a sense, no definitive proof has ever been established as to why, as an undeniable empirical fact, there were an unusually high number of childhood leukemias near Sellafield in the 1980s. Okay, so now we're getting more recent. Scott Zeger, who I mentioned earlier, works at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, and they have a department called International Health. I said, oh, that's interesting. Do you do anything in Britain? He said, no. International health is actually a euphemism for health in poor countries. Right? And global health, although you think it ought to mean health everywhere, it more or less means health, global health relevant to low and middle income countries. So I thought that was interesting. And when I came back to the UK, I found people who I haven't given workshops for, but who were working on disease control programs in Africa. And they were trying to draw maps. And the reason they were trying to draw maps is because if you're trying to do mass protection against nasty parasitic diseases by prophylactic administration of medication, then even if the medications cost nothing, which is true because Merck, the pharma company, gives the medicines free for the program that I work on, the distribution of those drugs is a formidable operational research problem in a low-income country. And the point about this slide is that the person on the motorbike is a field epidemiologist. And he's out on a 4-week tour collecting data on local prevalence of a very nasty disease called river blindness. And based on the data that people like him bring back to Ouagadougou, which is the capital of Burkina Faso, where the program is centered, you have to draw a risk map so that you can prioritize areas for distribution of the treatment. And to make a very long story very short, you use spatial statistical methods to turn the blue dots into the pink map. Because the fundamental problem of geostatistics is to say, how can you predict what's going on in a spatial phenomenon when you only have noisy data on that phenomenon at a finite set of locations within the area of interest? And this is not only using statistical methods to draw the map, it's using a very fundamental statistical concept to decide what to draw. Because what that map is not is our best map of prevalence. What it is our map of the predicted probability that prevalence exceeds what the WHO have ruled should be a priority for action. So the areas which are high priority for action are red, because we're pretty certain, in the very darkest colour, greater than 0.95, that they meet the criteria for prioritisation. The areas in yellow, they're very low priority. It's probably not a problem there. The pink areas are very important because the pink is a 50-50 call, and the pink area is I don't know. And some of you have heard me say this before, but I like to quote Donald Rumsfeld because he seems to be such an appalling man in every way except one, that his one pearl of wisdom was that the things that really get you are the unknown unknowns. In other words, if you don't know something, it's better to be honest about not knowing than to pretend that you know it. So I could have put an estimate of prevalence throughout that map, and I could have drawn a contour at 20%, which is the policy intervention threshold. But I didn't. I said, these are over 20, these are under 20, and honestly I don't know. And if it matters, you could obviously go and collect some more data. Not a trivial thing to do in these surroundings, but better that than to say, okay, my best guess is 20%, go for it. In my opinion. Okay, and that opens up, I think, something that has sort of crystallised in my mind as to where I personally feel I can contribute to statistics, but where it's also just as important that people whose work is really very, very unlike mine can and should contribute to statistics. How we do it, it's about time. Yeah. So, I again, in my presidential address, I suggested that we should revive a suggestion that John Nelden made many years ago, clearly before he died, but a long time before he died, that what people usually call mathematical statistics should really be called statistical mathematics. And the point there is that statistical science, I like to think of as working collaboratively with a scientist to solve a substantive problem that needs your joint intellectual input. So somebody who does t-test to order is not a statistical scientist, although they may be more than worthy of their crust, and maybe a better scientist than the doctor who insists they do them for them. But if you actually engage at the outset of an investigation into dialogue with subject matter scientists and bringing statistical insight and expertise to bear on the science, you're being a statistical scientist. If you're being a statistical mathematician, what you're doing is advancing the foundations of the discipline. And that's just as important because when we do statistics in a mathematical way, we're tending to be using not state-of-the-art maths, but yesterday's maths. And in 20, 30, 40 years' time, we'll need today's maths. So we have to keep both arms of our discipline going, the theoretical foundations and the intimate connection with science. And, it's sometimes said patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel. All right? You heard that phrase? I think that was Oscar Wilde who said that. Well, the last refuge of a statistical scoundrel is to quote David Cox in support of you, okay? And so there's David's advice to somebody starting the statistics department in a university. What should you do? And he says, go and talk to people in the department. And incidentally, in case you haven't heard it, Sir David Cox is the first and extraordinarily well-merited recipient of the International Prize in Statistics, which has been set up to be, in effect, a Nobel for statistics, there not being such a thing. So, I'm sure we're all delighted about that. 91 years old and still writing papers of biometry. Inspiration to us all. So, if I really want to sort of end on a slightly indulgent note, the way I see statistics contributing to scientific method more generally is that if you think of science ultimately as wanting to understand nature, so that's the pinnacle of what scientists do, they want to understand nature. Nature in the broad, it could be social, physical, environmental, medical, whatever, then they have two ways of exploring nature. One by doing theoretical work, one by doing experimental work, and both of those avenues lead to model building. But the models are different, because on the left-hand side of the triangle you have a model of the underlying scientific process they're trying to understand, and on the right-hand side you have a model of the data that they've collected. And what we can do with model statistics in a way that we really have enormous power now that we didn't have even 20 years ago, and we certainly didn't have when I started my career, is the ability to bridge that gap using essentially Bayes theory. Because if S is the state of nature and Y is the data, then the theoretical scientist can build a model for S. If they can't, then we'll do our best to replace them. We can certainly build models for data Y conditional on the state of nature, and Bayes theory inverts that joint distribution to give us what we want to know, which is what can we say about the state of nature in our data. And again, something many people have heard me say before, and therefore I'm surprised if I say it again, is that you don't have to be a Bayesian to believe in Bayes theorem. You just have to be sane. And what that's really saying is that very often, if you want to advance science, predictive inference is a very useful modality. Probably more useful than estimation in many cases. Certainly more useful than significance testing and all sorts. And the other corollary to being a statistical scientist is that you don't start with a method and look for a problem. You start with a problem and choose a method. So if you're being a statistical scientist, what you don't do is say, right, I do geostatistics. Have you got any problems for me to solve? You say, what problems have you got to solve? I'm a statistician, we should have a conversation. And I may end up using geostatistics, or to put it more concisely, analyse problems, not data. Okay, I think I'd better leave it there. Okay, thank you.